So in this video, I'm going to talk you through operant conditioning and try to explain to you some of the basic concepts behind it and also how it differs from classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is sometimes called behaviourism, and it's most closely associated with a chap called Skinner, who did most of his work through the 30s, 40s and 50s. So what is operant conditioning? It's about learning through consequence, so learning through the results of actions. It was developed by B.F. Skinner in the 1930s and the 1940s. And Skinner famously created something he called the Skinner box to test the behavioural responses and learning of small animals such as rats and pigeons. And it's one of the core elements of trying to understand where the evidence for this comes from, is to try and understand what that box does. The most basic part of operant conditioning is that a behaviour is only repeated if it's got a positive consequence. If the behaviour has got a negative consequence, then it stops. So if you or a rat do something and you get something positive out of it, then the rat or you are more likely to do that particular action again. If you do something and you get a negative consequence out of it, so you get a punishment of some description, then you would tend to stop. Skinner came up with something called the ABC model, and the ABC model is built like this. A is the antecedent. That's something that existed before. For example, the Skinner box that can present a stimulus, and it can present lights, it can present noise, lots of different elements. B is the behaviour, the way the organism acts. For example, the rat pressing the lever. C is the consequence of that behaviour. What happens, good or bad, from the behaviour? Getting food or getting an electric shock. We can understand the ABC model as a diagram. So here we've got the antecedent, so what's in the environment. We've got the behaviour, what the organism does, and then we've got the consequence of that behaviour. So if the consequence is one that is positive, so if the outcome is a positive one, like getting food, then that strengthens that behaviour. It's more likely to happen. But if that consequence is negative, so a punishment, then that weakens the likelihood of that behaviour happening again. Positive and negative reinforcement can be a little bit confusing. It's not quite the same as punishment. It's really focusing on the positive outcomes of a behaviour. So a positive reinforcement would be when you get a reward. A negative reinforcement is when you remove something bad. So in other words, the reward is removing an electric shock. So the rat learns to press a lever to stop an electric shock. Both of those result in behaviours being repeated. We can also think of positive and negative punishment. So positive punishment is something that unpleasant that happens as a consequence of a behaviour. Negative punishment is something pleasant that's removed as a consequence of a behaviour. So a positive punishment might be that a child is put in a detention. A negative punishment might be that a child is stopped from having an ice cream or a reward because they've done something they shouldn't have done. Punishment makes that action less likely to be repeated. There are different types of reinforcer. You've got some basic reinforcers like food, water, sex, shelter, help. These are things that help you survive. Those are your needs. But on the right-hand side, you've also got what you could think of as nice to haves, and those are things which might help you get a need. Now, let's think about that in terms of how that's actually described by Skinner. So we're going to talk about those as primary and secondary reinforcers. So a primary reinforcer would be those that meet our basic survival needs like food, sex, water, shelter. A secondary reinforcer is simply there to fulfill a primary need. For example, we want money because therefore we can buy food. So money becomes a secondary reinforcer because it helps us get what we need from our primary reinforcer. Make sure that you have looked at very carefully the research evidence for this. There's evidence, lots of evidence to support it, but it's an incomplete explanation. There are some positives about it being applied to the real world, so there's lots and lots of things out there for you to look at, but make sure that you've covered A03 on page 135 of your textbook fully, and you want to have 3 or 4 strengths, 3 or 4 weaknesses. If there's not quite enough in your textbook, make sure you look on both pages 134 and 135. Have a look on the internet. For example, Simply Psychology will give you a lot of this stuff as well. So I'm going to move on to something I'm going to call a schedule of reinforcement. Now, when Skinner started out, what he tried to do is to basically, every time the rat pressed the button on the lever, he got a reward. So it looks like this. Rat presses button, gets food. Rat presses button, gets food. That's known as continuous reinforcement. Every single time the rat presses the button or the lever, gets a reward. What Skinner was interested in is what's the impact on learning? Well, that is he found that was a very fast behavior to learn. The animals were able to work it out very, very quickly, but also it was the fastest to extinguish. So if you stopped giving food when the button was pressed, the rat would very, very quickly learn to stop pressing the button. So we've now got something called partial reinforcement schedules, and there are 2 types of partial reinforcement schedule. The first one is called a ratio, and the second one is called a interval. And I'm going to deal with partial ratio reinforcement schedules first. So a fixed ratio is when you give a reward after a set number of responses. So, for example, the rat presses the button twice, gets food, or the rat presses the button 10 times, gets food. You get very high and stable performance, so the rat keeps doing it. Unfortunately, if you stop doing it, if you did it, for example, you didn't do it after 10 times, you did it after 11, and you weren't particularly consistent, then the rat having learned that, then you would get very fast extinction. So Skinner tried something else. He tried something he called variable ratio, which was to give rewards after some responses. So the rat gets food after pressing the button sometimes 2 times, sometimes 3 times, sometimes 4 times. The point is that the rat can't predict how many times he has to press the button to get his food. And what Skinner found is that that behavior was slow to extinguish. It didn't stop very, very quickly at all. And you got pretty high, pretty regular performance. And actually, variable ratio is the way that slot machines work. You're going to get a reward. You just can't predict when. And that keeps you playing because you get a reward. You think, okay, I did it twice. Okay, I've got a reward. Maybe it'll happen again. Can't predict it, but I'm going to keep playing and see if I'm right. Interval means time. So again, we've got fixed and we've got variable. Fixed interval is giving a reward after a certain number of time, a set amount of time. So the rat gets food every 5 minutes, or the rat gets food every 7 minutes, or whatever it is. So that rat can predict how much time he's got to wait. Again, this has fast extinction. It disappears very, very quickly. And it's pretty average performance. The rat isn't very good at learning this. Variable interval is much better. You give a reward after different amounts of time. So the rat gets food every 5 or every 10 or every 30 minutes. The rat can't predict how much time he's got to wait. He knows it's going to happen, but he can't predict it. And again, slow extinction, high stable performance. So it's a slow behavior to disappear, but it's a behavior also that keeps going. The final elements that you need to worry about with operant conditioning are something called behavioural shaping. So what you want to do is to get a behaviour that isn't natural, something that isn't innate. For example, a preschool child raising their hand in school to answer a question. So what you do is you reward each behaviour that gets successively closer to the behaviour you want. So for example, the child might look at you and you reward them when they answer a question. Or the child might move their hand and then you reward that. You train guide dogs exactly the same way, and there are lots of videos out there. If you looked for behavioural shaping, look for dogs in particular, and you'll see a lot of this going on. It's used a lot, as I say, in dog training and in potty training. Another really good place to look is Super Nanny. If you search for that on the internet, if you haven't seen it already, then go for it. Overall, you need to make sure that for both classical and operant, you must have evidence. And I've got a very basic summary here of the main elements that you might look for. Both of them have high reliability and internal validity. They're very, very strong lab experiments. They can be repeated a lot and you get the same results. They both generate quantitative data that you can analyze without it being particularly subjective. So it's very objective type of data. And there are applications to real life in both classical and operant. The weaknesses is that they're quite often criticized for having low ecological validity. Pavlov's classical conditioning experiments were done on dogs in a lab, and Skinner's experiments on rats and pigeons were again done in a lab-based environment. A lot of these experiments and both theories are based on a lot of animal evidence, so perhaps they're not as generalizable to human beings who are perhaps more sophisticated cognitively, emotionally. We have a different genome to rats and pigeons and dogs, so perhaps the generalizability isn't as good either. And there are also issues within the ethical and animal care arena that we need to think about as well.